listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I'm Maryna Shevtsova, Senior FWO Researcher at Lions, and I'm pleased to welcome with us today Dr. Alexandra Yatsyk. Alexandra, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Alexandra Yatsyk is a researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, sorry for my French pronunciation or mispronunciation, at the University of Lille, and she's also an adjunct professor at the Sciences Po, France. Her expertise covers identity making in Eastern Europe, biopolitics, illiberalism, and art. Dr. Yatsyk served as a researcher in Europe and the US, including the Johann Skytte Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu, Polish Academy of Sciences, Uppsala Institute of Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw, Vienna Institute for Human Sciences, the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, and others. Thank you again, Alexandra, for joining us today, and I wanted to start asking you to tell just a couple of words about your own research within the framework of the Ukrainian Heritage UKR project.
The project just started, the fieldwork is still ongoing, and in this part of my research, I'm focusing on European Union external actions and the field of Ukrainian heritage. So I'm meeting and talking with European Union officials, including those who work in UNESCO, who are dealing with monitoring, assessment, and documentation of damage to cultural heritage in Ukraine, who organize trainings for Ukrainian museum professionals and for military community. And the general question here is about heritage diplomacy between the European Union and Ukraine, both in form of theory and actions. So this is the question of transferring knowledge and governance in state of emergency. And this is basically a question about how to protect heritage in the country which is in the ongoing war. This is a very new situation for some of institutions, such as, for instance, UNESCO. Another research which I'm dealing with is my ongoing research on so-called memory wars in Estonia. And this time I'm particularly focusing on the new waves of demolishing of the Soviet monuments in Estonia, provoked by the Russian full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And here I analyze discourse on the issue both in Estonian and Russian languages. And my main question here is how a common past is remembered in a democratic society such as in Estonia, and such in a society which groups adopt a contrarian collective memory, including Estonian Russian speakers, that potentially endangers the identity of the titular nation.
Alexandra, in the paper that I recommend our listeners to read, the paper that you wrote with Vladimir Sazonov on Soviet monuments in Estonian media after Russian invasion of Ukraine, there you introduce the concept of mnemonic security. Could you please elaborate more on this, explain what it is, and tell us what role this concept plays out in case of Estonia, especially after February 2022?
The concept of mnemonic security has been extensively developing in international relations and in memory studies, and in particular by Maria Malkso. And according to her, mnemonic security implies a policy that makes certain historical memories secure by delegitimizing others. In particular, she's talking about the securitization of memory in law, in producing a specific legislation in attempt to so-called protect a certain historical memory from others that can contest it. And in Estonian society, the latter is displayed by Russian speakers, which is a quite sizable part of society. So some of them, not all of them, but some of them consider the Soviet era and its material objects, such as Second World War monuments, constitutive for their identity. And for these Russian speakers, many of who live in Ida-Virumaa, in eastern part of Estonia and in its capital of Narva, for this part of society, the presence of the Soviet-era monuments in public places is a sort of recognition by the Estonian government of the status of this community as an unequal member of the society. But for Estonians, on contrary, the monuments glorifying the Soviet-era regime are reminders about the Soviet occupation of their country, about the dark time and all suffering that it brought to its people. The concept of mnemonic security raises a question on limits of this securitization. And so for Malkso, the ultimate cementing of the memory in law for the sake of security, if, for example, it refers to the survival of the nation or to the ontological security, this cementing can lead to depolitization of memory, which implies the erosion of meanings. And in this regard, memory used for political purpose becomes a prisoner of political reductionism and begins to resemble an ideology. So my research question here is to understand how Estonia tries to avoid this over-securitization after the Russian invasion, if any.
Further building on this, could you tell more about this dismantling of the monuments? Does it mean that Estonia simply destroyed them, or were they moved elsewhere? And if you could you compare this also to other countries that had similar past and they also had the Soviet-era monuments? What did they do? Was the Estonian case quite unique, or maybe it has similarities across other regional cases?
Yeah, absolutely not unique. This monument war actually started in 90s after Estonia regained its independence. So we can see these similar trends, absolutely the similar trends in Ukraine, in Baltic states, in Poland as well. But in Estonia, because of its sizable part of Russian speakers, there were quite a lot of the Second World War monuments which remained until 2022. And the question whether it actually was a necessity to keep them, but because of these politics, of memory politics of the Estonian government, they preferred to keep them. And there were not all of them destroyed. A lot of them were just dismissed from their initial places. They became now just a museum object. They were collected in some museums spaces. And again, this is not something new in practices of museification of objects of memory. So the famous example is the Park of Terror in Hungary. In Estonia, there is, as I said, a sizable group of Russian speakers. So not all of them support the idea of keeping these monuments in public spaces, but quite a lot of them still for having these monuments. And probably the most famous example, an example of the city of Narva and this tank monument that was in Narva until 2022. So after the invasion, the question whether it should be dismantled and dismissed, erased, and now it's in a war museum in Vimsi. That was not the question of social unrest. We can't compare this situation with the Bronze Soldier Night that took place in 2007, when the monument to so-called Bronze Soldier has been dismissed to Walsh Cemetery near Tallinn. But this is still a sensitive question for Narva natives. It was a big discussion in media in 2022. And we were interested in how this discussion took place in a sense of identity building of Russian speakers.
You just mentioned media, and this is a nice move to my next question about how, of course, media always plays a role in shaping public attitudes. I wonder, in Estonia, whether you looked at both Estonian language and Russian language media, if Russian language media is still there, and how actually the discourses were different. What was the discussion about this desovietization, and especially after 2022? Was there a change in them? And do you think it also, again, influenced the attitudes and the mood in the society within the Russian-speaking minority, which is not that small, as you mentioned, and among broader public?
Well, indeed, our analysis revealed a spike of media interest to the Soviet monuments after Russian invasion of Ukraine. And since February 2022, Estonian media published articles on the Soviet urban legacy in both languages, 5 times more than during the previous decade. Also, we realized that in 2022, state-supported media narratives on the Soviet monuments dominated both language spaces. So around 97% of Estonian language and around 70% of Russian language media publications shared the hegemonic narratives that described the Soviet war monuments as those glorifying the occupation regime, which in turn justifies their dismantlement, relocation, and remodeling. But in general sense, we can say that this mainstream discourse on mnemonic securitization of Soviet-era monuments developed along three sub-discourses. This is not a homogeneous discourse, so it consists of so-called moderate case-by-case approach to the issue. And we can definitely see a variety of opinions in this discourse, but the general idea is that the Soviet monuments should be erased from Estonian public space, and the war tombs should be treated with respect to victims, disregarding whether these Soviet soldiers, Russian Soviet soldiers, or Estonian Soviet soldiers. The second discourse we found is, which we preliminarily called discourse of Estonian nationalists. Here we can see two extremum as represented by far rights and also by Estonian far lefts. Of course, again, so this is not a homogeneous discourse, but on one part of extreme we can see the opinion represented by far rights, who say that all Soviet-era symbols should be removed, not necessarily right now. Probably it's better to spend money for supporting Ukraine, for instance. And Estonian leftists say that the only Soviet-Russian monuments are threats to Estonian mnemonic security, and that why they have to be removed. So the Soviet Estonian monuments should remain. So this is a kind of a selective approach to the Soviet-era monuments. Also, we found the obvious pro-Kremlin discourse in Russian language, which promoted the idea that the Soviet Union liberated Estonia from Nazism, and Estonians also fought along with the Soviets. And since Estonians belong to the Soviet Union, it's not fair to destroy Soviet monuments. This current politics, as represented by Estonian government, actually is just a manipulation with ordinary people, and this is just a part of the plot masterminded by the United States. And the most interesting discourse that we found is represented by a so-called post-Soviet regionalism. And according to this discourse, this is a Russian language discourse, Soviet-era symbols are not security threats, and they are just pillars of identity of Russian-speaking community in Estonia, and that's why they shouldn't be removed from public places, but it couldn't be probably rethought in a sense of meanings and a sense of significance.
Very complex issue. The more you talk about it, the more tricky it becomes. And my next question is, I think, also complicated, and you can't probably have the definite answer, but still knowing, what you have just mentioned about the importance of the memory of the Second World War and its key part in the identity of people who were born in the Soviet Union, take it or leave it, right? So how do you think now removing these monuments, will it result in the nearest, say, decade, 2 decades, in actually indeed better social cohesion in Estonia, or do you think it will alienate Russian-speaking minority more?
Well, this is my personal opinion as a scholar, and I strictly believe that it's good for Estonian coherency and building a common identity of those who live in Estonia, including Estonian Russophones, because we can see obviously that there is a way of, I would say, Estonianization of Estonian Russophone in the sense of becoming a part of Estonian society, being Estonian citizens. But still there is not so big percentage of those who are not Estonian citizens. And they have these nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And this is not all a question of generation, unfortunately. Probably this is a question of education and reproduction of this social and cultural inertia and also nostalgia. But I believe that it's good for Estonian society, for the future Estonian society, and especially in the sense of building a more coherent society. And we also can see different discussions or how to do with this problem. And one of the discursive strategy, probably one of decision how to go beyond this Soviet loop of identity making is to build something new identity which could be rooted into pre-Soviet times, and try to emphasize the importance of those Russians who lived in Estonia before the Soviet occupation. Like, for example, the Russian poet Igor Severyanin. This is one way how to Estonian Russian speakers could go beyond this Soviet style mentality.
Museums. Before we go to the end of our interview, I really wanted to ask you about your vision of the role of museums and memorials, such as Viimsi, if I pronounce it correctly, correct me if not, a war museum. Do you think that they are important for mediating memories of war, memory politics, and do you think this is something that could be helpful for building this new identity?
Yeah, I think that they are very helpful because they are dedicated spaces to commemorate the issues, and again, this is a widespread practice, how to commemorate the sensitive issues. As I said, we can find many examples of how these memorials on war monuments could be organized in special places. So I think that this is a right way to deal with war monuments. And also we can see how it works. For example, in Estonia, this Viimsi Museum is a place where this tank monument has been transferred. And if you look at number of visitors in the month when this monument was transferred, we can see that it rised in several times. So people became more interested in war museums. And this was a kind of promotion and advertisement for Viimsi Museum.
So to summarize, do you have some optimism, and particularly in these dark times geopolitically, when it comes to building more inclusive or maybe more complicated memory politics for Estonia? Do you see their potential for a better one?
Well, yes, I'm an optimist, and I also think that Estonia acting wisely in this regard, because this was a balanced memory politics in Estonia regarding the Russian-speaking issue. I think that it is still a wisely memory politics despite all criticism, and I think that it's likely agonistic, not antagonistic memory, which means that there is a chance for consensus.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for your insightful talk. And again, we encourage listeners to read more of Alexandra Yatsyk's works. And goodbye for now. Follow our new episodes.